we're back, and in a different format. So for once I've actually decided to show my face instead of just being faceless behind the camera. That might turn some people away, but The Eighth Doctor stories of the Big Finish main range were the first times for Paul McGann to actually shine as the Doctor, after that terrible TV movie, which you probably already know my thoughts on. If you don't, please check out the video. But anyway, they're only something that I've been getting into rather recently, and by recently I mean like 3 or 4 months ago. Mainly because the first 50 are free on Spotify, making it quite easy to listen to and something that you should definitely check out, along with the first 2 series of Dalek Empire, which are... they're okay. But that's not what we're here to talk about, at all. We're here to talk about the adventures of the Eighth Doctor and Charley Pollard. So without further ado, let's begin. Storm warning. It's quite good, honestly. Just as a preface, I'm going to do all of this based on pretty much just memory to keep it spoiler-free. Of course, I do have to look at some things to remember it, but it's good to get the outline of the story out there, and, if I can't remember it, was it really any good anyway? So the rundown is that the Eighth Doctor runs into this trapped timeship in the Vortex, which is currently being hounded and attacked by these creatures called Vortisaurs. They're like a proto-version of the Reapers from Series 1, and they feed off of time energy, like scavengers or vultures, basically. He thinks that he's gotten rid of them, so lands the TARDIS, which just so happens to be inside of a drainage tank of the R101 airship, a real airship that crashed in 1930, and despite having more casualties than the Hindenburg, is not as well known. When I first listened to this, I thought that it was just trying to be the Hindenburg, or a nice reference to it, but it was an actual real event that happened. It's just not really well known. I guess that airships crashing is just very common of a thing. It's almost like airships are just aren't a very good idea. On the ship is a stowaway, who is our brand new companion, Charley Pollard. She ends up getting found out, runs away, meets the Eighth Doctor, runs away from him, and then encounters a Vortisaur, which has managed to tail off the back of the TARDIS. Except that's not the only threat here. As it turns out, this ship isn't just destined for Singapore, it's destined to meet up with an alien race called the Triskel, which is why it has the entire country's chiefs of staff, the designer of the ship, and also a guy called Lord Tamworth, who appears to have funded it. I'm honestly not too sure. He's a stand-in for the real Lord Thompson, who is played here wonderfully by Gareth Roberts. Gareth Roberts?! Who's a stand-in for the real Lord Thompson and is played here by Gareth Thomas, who, if you don't know, is Blake from Blake 7. But there's also another threat. As it turns out, the second-in-command, a guy called Rathbone, is working for British intelligence, so ends up breaking down the peace deal. There's a lot to follow in this, but it all makes sense when you're listening to it. As a first story, this is honestly a really great introduction, and since it doesn't really specify that it takes exactly after the TV movie, then, you could probably slot the EDAs in there. Or maybe some of them, they do end up getting a little bit wacky. Paul McGann is a really great actor, and it's great to see that his on-screen personality translates to a different medium really well. And he also just has a really nice voice to listen to, so I guess that helps. One very strange voice to pin down is that of Barnaby Edwards, who plays Rathbone, and also appears in the next 3 stories as minor characters, something that I noticed straight away. He puts on this really strange South African accent, and I can't really tell why. It's okay, but at the end of the day, you can tell that, 1, it's not his main accent, and it just doesn't really work. It could really be worse, and for sure isn't the most annoying accent of the series. That comes very soon. The Triskel as villains are kind of a weird one, as they're basically not. Essentially, the species is split up into 3. You've got the intelligent engineers, the warrior uncreators, and the lawgiver, who keeps the peace between the 3 of them. Their plan here is basically to inhabit 3 different humans, all with the traits of each of them, except thanks to Rathbone, it all goes downhill. The Doctor and Charley end up escaping, and he decides that he'll have to get to Singapore. Eventually. As first they've got to take the Vortisaur back to the Time Vortex, which they've affectionately named Ramsey. For some reason, the Vortisaur is not exactly a big fan of Charley's and ends up harassing her quite a lot. I'm sure this won't be a major plot point later. Overall, an 8 out of 10, just by how much that I actually want to tell you and reveal of this story and actually remember of it. You can see how good it is. But anyway, on to the next one. Sword of Orion. It's the second story, and we've already got one of the big two. And if you couldn't tell, it's the Cybermen. Yeah, it's the Cybermen. So the Doctor and Charley have landed in the future during the Orion War, which is basically a conflict where humans are fighting against the androids that they've created, and those androids have taken up refuge in the Orion galaxy. Makes sense. So how are the Cybermen involved? Well, in a nebula or an ion storm, I really can't remember, there's a derelict cybership left over from the recent cyber wars, because according to Doctor Who lore, there's always some cyber war going on with humanity. And since a salvage crew have just recently stumbled upon it, I have a slight feeling it's not going to go great. The Doctor and Charley hitch aboard a salvage ship that's actually still on the TARDIS, and it conveniently makes its way to the cyber ship in the nebula, or the ion storm, or whatever it is, which ends up waking the Cybermen up. One thing I can really give the story here is its treatment of the villains themselves, the Cybermen. They actually feel powerful and just absolutely demolish people. It's really good to see, and something that we never really see on TV. I mean, the closest is probably Attack of the Cybermen, where they crush Lytton's hand until his bones crack and fingers bleed. But, I mean, we never really get it any other time. They're also regarded as a serious threat. You can tell that Nicholas Briggs really knows what he's writing for, as not only are they incredibly strong and powerful, they're also really fast too. He really knows the source material when he's writing about them. It's good to finally see the Cybermen not played off as a joke. But what's the significance of the Orion War here? Well, the androids have sent an agent to find the Cybermen and recruit them for their techniques of conversion, likely to find a way to adapt humans into androids and increase their forces. But at the same time, the humans also want to find the Cybermen so that they can either find ways of killing the androids quicker or just create an army for themselves, which, I mean, replacing one army with another? That's a fantastic idea. It's like in, I think, California when the city tried to get rid of pigeons, so just employed owls to do it for them. I say employed like they're paying them, they're not paying them. So they employed owls to do it for them, and then realised now we have an owl problem. Great idea, guys. In full honesty, the best way to describe this story is just mid. I can't find too much to fault it, but also can't find too much to praise it at the same time. The twist is also painfully obvious, and I realised it pretty quickly. I'm pretty sure that this was just made to set up for the later Cybermen series that would be released, which also contained the exact same cast as Dalek Empire. I will never unhear that. 4 out of 10. Not too bad, but also not that great either. The Stones of Venice. This one on the outside looks unassuming. I mean, the cover and the name don't really give much away, but it's one that I actually really enjoy. Deciding to take a well-deserved break after adventuring, the two end up in Venice, on the eve of its sinking. Venice is run by Count Orsino, who is here played by classic Who legend Michael Sheard. You probably know him as the headmaster from Remembrance of the Daleks, so it's nice to see him back. Orsino has run Venice for over 100 years, being cursed with immortality by his former bride, Estella, who swiftly drowned herself after the wedding. If I'm perfectly honest, I don't really remember much about this story. All that I do remember is that I left it pretty satisfied by the end, and thought that it was, well, quite good overall. It also starts this trend in the series where the Doctor and Charley get split up, but it's usually done quite well, so it's not too much of an annoyance to see. What starts to really rear its head is the returning cast members, particularly Barnaby Edwards, who also happens to be a Dalek operator on the show. He's got good range, but I immediately realised that something was familiar. It's not too much of an issue, but it can be a bit jarring. It feels like a really rich story. The world building of Venice is really good, the sound of the water, the period music, despite it being set in the far future, it's really nice to listen to. Overall, a 6 out of 10. Pretty enjoyable, but nothing special, considering I can't really remember too much of it. Minuet in Hell. Oh boy, this one is very crazy. Right off the bat, the Doctor is not the Doctor, and Charley is playing the part of a Playboy bunny girl, but instead it's for the Hellfire Club and not Hugh Hefner. The Doctor is sat in a loony bin, unable to remember who he is, where he is, or how he got there. But he does know a couple things, being his name, which is Zebediah Doe, and the guy in the cell next to him, Gideon Crane, who for some reason thinks that he's the Doctor, and also happens to be Nicholas Briggs. So yeah, just to put it out there, Gideon Crane is played by Nicholas Briggs, making this one of the many stories where he gets to play alongside his favourite actors. He is pretty good though, and is also technically the Doctor since he played a version of the Ninth Doctor. Not very well, mind you. Our story is set in the brand new 51st state of the United States of America, Malabolgia. And I don't really remember them actually telling us where it is, but according to Wiki it's in the southeast, and judging by the accents, is very likely just half of Florida. The main villain and actual owner of the Hellfire Club is a man called Brigham Elijah Dashwood III, the man pegged to become governor of Malabolgia due to his altruism in the area. The thing with the Hellfire Club is that it's not just a den of sleazy, fat, old high members of society, it's actually got some proper backing to it, with the real devil showing up. Of course, it isn't really the devil. It's a demon going by the name of Marcosius, who is working with Dashwood to convince the patrons in the Hellfire Club that the devil is actually real. I mean, all of them probably are Christian, so believe it anyway, but I digress. So what does Marcosius get out of this? Well, I'm sure you've guessed it by now, but he's not actually a demon, he's an alien. His species are called psionivores, who feed upon negative energy, and since this den of sleazy, fat, old high members of society is full of negative energy, it's essentially a feeding ground for him and his brothers. But we also have another threat to contend with. Dashwood's assistant, the not-so-glamorous Dr. Pargeter, who, along with running his mental hospital and also his secret experiments, is his lover, sort of. The good doctor has a machine that can edit the minds of the patients. Originally I thought this was going to be connected to the mind of evil, which would make sense, as the Brigadier is here, but it's just not. Which is a shame, as it would probably make the story quite a bit better. I'll give it a 7 out of 10. It's quite interesting, has good magical elements, and a unique way to actually separate the Doctor and Charlie, but I just despise the accents so much. An issue that the next story fixes with Invaders from Mars. Invaders from Mars is such a mixed bag for me. I mean, it has so many ways that it improves on the last story, but also many ways that it just doesn't. On one particular note, the accents are a lot nicer to listen to. I mean, I don't know if that's because I personally prefer New York to the Deep South, or whether the actors are just better or what, but either way it's a noticeable improvement. The year is 1938, and it's Halloween in New York City. From the title I could immediately tell what this story would be about, but I'm not too sure that it's generally well known. In a Halloween broadcast by Orson Welles, his production of War of the Worlds accidentally convinced thousands of Americans on the East Coast that they were currently being invaded by Martians with tripods, and they'd already obliterated New Jersey. So how did this happen? Well, there was a warning message before broadcast that told people this isn't real, it's just in a format that would make it seem real. But the problem was about 90% of the people that listened to it didn't hear it, so thought it was actually live newscasting directly to them. So you can see where the confusion comes in. The thing is that it actually created literal panic in the streets, and people were running around New York and the East Coast thinking that they were about to be completely obliterated. I wonder what people in New Jersey thought. That they were already dead? So anyway, back to the story. The Doctor and Charlie have landed in New York and assume the role of a dead detective and his assistant. They're hired by a woman called Glory B, who wants them to find her uncle, who's a scientist that's gone missing. This is where the story gets really big. We have a grand total of 4 separate threats to deal with. The first are the local mafia, who have alien technology. The second is a Nazi sympathizer who wants to sell the alien technology to the Germans for the upcoming war. The third is the Russians, who want to take the scientists back to Moscow and then also use the alien technology for the upcoming war. And fourth, the actual aliens themselves, all packed inside of the Brooklyn Bridge. The actual aliens themselves don't even appear until part 3, and were not at all what I was expecting. I thought they'd be more like the aliens from Mars Attacks, and what reinforces that idea and made me think this was written with some beautiful subtext was one single scene. Basically, the aliens known as laid placas, which I will not be calling them here, are fascinated by the idea of building a bridge to get over large bodies of water. Now, I thought that since this was a Mars Attacks reference, they'd be weak to water and it would kill them, so harm them. So why would they ever try to touch water or get over it? They'd avoid it like the plague, right? But it just turns out that they can fly over bodies of water because they're bats. Don't get me wrong, just because of the fake narrative that I built up making this some amazingly crafted story doesn't mean that this is written by a bad writer, because it's not. It's written by Mark Gatiss, and you can tell that it's written by a guy who's got some pedigree behind him. Let me give you an example. In Minuet, Marcosius says something like... No. Let me give you an example. In Minuet, Marcosius says something like, "I'm 8 feet of hellfire coming straight towards you," whereas the aliens in Invaders call humans hairless things, telling you that they are furry creatures and have wings, which I guess the bridge comment also tells you about, but I mean, I didn't get it. I feel like I'm really overselling this story for being significantly better than it is. It's alright. It suffers from being very confusing and a bit dull at the end, and there were scenes where I was just sitting there quite confused at who was speaking or what was even going on. And it's not like I'm distracted. I'm usually listening to these while walking for long periods of time, so my full attention is diverted to these stories. But the final 2 parts really do save it, and make it an enjoyable listen. This is also the beginning of what I'll dub Season 2 of the 8th Doctor's main range. Basically, how this is produced is a block of 4 in a row from Storm Warning all the way to Minuet and Hell, and then a block of 6 from this to Neverland, and then 17 stories we get Zagreus as number 50. And it's also the start of a new change in the title music. We've had for the whole thing the David Arnold theme, which is really nice. It's dark, gritty, and it tickles my ears in just the right places, which makes it perfectly S tier. But for some reason for Season 2 they decided to cut out the kind of a wind-up at the beginning and get straight into it. I don't know if this is just to get straight into the stories or what, but it's okay. So, Invaders from Mars. 7 out of 10 as well. Though if I'm honest, I do not remember in the slightest how it actually ends. The Chimes of Midnight. 10 out of 10. Best thing to come out of this range. In all seriousness though, this is as good as people say it is. Though that doesn't mean it doesn't have any shortcomings. Our TARDIS team lands inside of an Edwardian scullery, but all is not as it seems. Any action that's performed on an object in the house is immediately undone as they're stuck in a time loop. At a chime of the grandfather clock, they're brought into the time loop, and what ensues is a deep dive murder mystery into class struggles and finally who Charley is as a person. I really don't want to reveal too much as it's so good and you should definitely give it a listen yourself. But that doesn't mean I can't talk about what I do really like. The biggest thing here is that we actually get to learn about who Charley is as a person, which feels strange as we're 6 stories in now. The thing is, she's really good, and would work if she were to come back as a character on the main show, or if Paul McGann were to get his own miniseries. Having a character that hails from the 1930s is great for exposition, and she can also put up a fight when she needs to. What we learn here is Charley's past as the daughter of a lord, and her childhood interacting with the staff. Also, just as a side note, India Fisher is on loads of the covers, but for some reason whenever I hear her, I always imagine her to be Emma from Curse of the Fatal Death. I don't know, just to me they sound quite similar. This is where the class elements come in, as each character repeats the phrase, "I am nothing, I am nobody." Let's quickly run through them. We have Edith, who is the scullery maid. It's the lowest position in the house, but she turns out to be the most important character in the whole story. There's Mary, the lady's maid, who gets the least amount of screen time, and when given the tasks of the scullery maid to perform, says it's beneath her. She's having an affair with the next character, Freddie, the chauffeur. Although we don't get to hear it, he drives a Chrysler. What? No, a Bentley. His side of the love affair is a lot less invested than Mary's. Next we have the cook, Mrs. Badley, who makes the Christmas plum pudding. I mean, Christmas wouldn't be Christmas without Mrs. Badley's plum pudding. And finally, Mr. Shaughnessy, the butler to his lordship and the head of staff. Despite all being working class, they're all pitted against each other. Let's start from the top this time. Shaughnessy looks down on everyone. To him, they're all replaceable. And of course, as a man, there is the aspect of women being beneath his status. I don't know whether this is intentional or not, whether Rob Shearman specified this when writing the script, but Shaughnessy's played with an Irish accent, which is definitely on purpose as the actor is from Yorkshire, but by making him Irish it adds a whole nother layer of depth to the man. In 1906, when the story is set, Irish people were essentially seen as beneath English people. I'm sure that lots of us have seen the sign of no dogs, no blacks, no Irish that was plastered all over different pubs. So for a man of his background to have clawed his way to the top, it's really commendable, but also means that he has no sympathy whatsoever for people beneath him that may be a threat. He's worked hard for his position, so will stop at nothing to keep it. Next on the pecking order is Mrs. Badley, a woman with the main character trait of putting other women down. If you've read in Inspector Calls, the quote from Mrs. Burling, "Girls of that class," essentially sums up her entire attitude, especially towards Edith, who she hates just for being beneath her. Further down we have Freddy, who, simply out of being a man that can drive, which I'm sure was quite a rarity for the lower class in those days, I've put above Mary. Freddy represents the general attitude of men at the time, seeing them as second-class citizens. In his affair with Mary, he's not actually serious about her, just seeing her as a bit of fun. I mean, really, the chauffeur with the scullery maid? No, the lady's maid. Mary's the lady's maid. Mary's the hardest one for me to pin down because other than her affair with Freddy, she doesn't really have much to do and feels kind of redundant to the story. I don't really have much to say on her. And finally, right at the bottom, we have Edith, the scullery maid, the lowest position in the house. Always abused, shouted at, never praised. Her life is a living hell. In full honesty, the Chimes of Midnight feels like if an Inspector Calls focused on the staff rather than the gentry. I mean, Edith and Edna sound pretty close, right? Speaking of the gentry, where is his lordship and ladyship? My only complaint is rather minor, but is just with the way it's written sometimes feels a little bit handholdy. Charley utters some lines that go like, if I point the torch here, or if I move the candle over here. It just takes me out of it sometimes, but it's nothing too major. As I said, 10 out of 10. Edward Grove is alive. Seasons of Fear. I went into this story with the expectation that it was going to be really bad. I mean, Davis had it as his 5th worst 8th Doctor story. But then again, that video did come out before Doomsday. So, take that with a grain of salt. So to say that my expectations were low would be an understatement. And I also knew who the twist villains were thanks to the video. But I was actually pleasantly surprised with how much I've really enjoyed it. At a New Year's Day party in Singapore, the immortal Sebastian Grail approaches the Doctor and declares that in his future, he has killed the Doctor. Of course, surprised, the Doctor decides to investigate, leading him on a journey through Roman times, the court of Edward the Confessor, the original Hellfire Club, and deep within the Time Vortex. But how did Grail become immortal? And who are his mysterious masters? It's a pretty good premise and a really enjoyable trip. Since each part is contained within its own time zone, it divides up the story into 4 nice little mini adventures of sorts. My only complaint is one track that gets used like every other minute has this little clinking sound that really scratches at the back of my brain, and once I'd noticed it, I just couldn't get rid of it, and it really diverted my attention away from the story. But other than that, it is very good. The twist villain is, yes, one that I unfortunately had spoiled for me from the video, but he did put a spoiler warning in, so I guess I just never thought I'd listen to this. I'm not going to say who it is, but it was honestly quite underwhelming, and they only actually appear in the 4th part, though the way that they are defeated is quite spectacular. What is interesting is that this story actually marks the beginning of the Zagreus arc, with an off-the-cuff retelling of the Zagreus rhyme, an old Gallifreyan piece that the Doctor's mother used to tell him. You know what else is old and Gallifreyan? Not too much to say, but it's an 8 out of 10. I enjoyed it just about as much as Storm Warning. Embrace the darkness. Yet again, another where I'd heard literally nothing about it before listening, so was going in dark. I'm so sorry. In the Time Vortex, the Doctor makes a hasty escape from a group of Type 70 TARDISes that are looking for him, ending up in the Cimmeria system, always wanting to check it out and see why its sun just went out one day. On Cimmeria 4, a research team has been attacked by creatures in the darkness, taking away the light from them, though it's not exactly what they think. The team have called for a rescue robot called Rosum, who identifies Charley as a threat due to her impurities. Basically, in the future, humans have gotten to the point where gene splicing is so advanced, any impurity that a baby could have is removed before birth. Stuff like potential cancers, growths, tumours, physical deformities, anything that could bring down the quality of life. And since Charley has benign cells that could one day become threatening to her, hailing from the 1930s, she's seen as a threat to the human race by Rosum. So on top of the monsters, Rosum adds an extra layer of threat, especially considering he's not just one single robot, but seemingly a whole army of them. While the storyline is a bit mediocre, the twists are by far the standout of the story. I mean, the end of part 1 is something that really made me gasp, and I didn't expect at all. Another real strong point is by far the atmosphere of the story. Now, I'm not a sound engineer or anyone with any kind of sound knowledge, but the sound design is fantastic. You really feel like you're there and that the bass is underwater. It's just so claustrophobic and fantastic. What's not great sound design wise are the Cimmerians. I get that making every monster unique and different can only be achieved with so many filters and modulators, but it really takes me out the story when I can't understand what they're saying, so have to guess, and probably got it wrong quite a lot of the time. Other than that, it's genuinely a good story, and as I said, the twist at part 1 is amazing, and something that I think everyone should experience. 6 out of 10. Not too great, but it was definitely impactful where it needed to be. The Time of the Daleks. Welcome to the first actual dud of the series. Before I begin, it's really important to understand that the central focus of this story is William Shakespeare. And even after listening to the entire thing, I don't really understand why. So the Daleks are back at the time experiments again, but this time it's gone a tad bit wrong and they're continuously exploding in a time loop for all eternity. But luckily, before the loop began, 3 Daleks managed to escape, connecting to mid-21st century Earth, where the dictator of New Britain, the benevolent General Maria Learman, has also been conducting time travel experiments, but instead of with time machines, with mirrors. You do not know how long that line took me to do. After fighting in the Euro Wars, Learman essentially just walked into Parliament and took over, beginning her benevolent dictatorship. How is it benevolent? Honestly, I'm not too sure, but apparently she's really willing to give up her role for 3 elections in the future. Eventually. Yeah, that's what they all say, Learman. The only reason she hasn't given up power yet is because of a rebellion that's risen up thanks to mass amounts of people forgetting about Shakespeare. It's rather convenient, that. This is where the Doctor and Charlie comes in, as he's absolutely dumbfounded during a conversation in the TARDIS that she has no idea who this icon is. Now, if you don't really like Shakespeare, you probably aren't going to like this story, as it's obvious that the writer has some sort of affinity to him, as every now and again, maybe every few minutes, there's some kind of Shakespeare quote, some mention of Shakespeare, and the characters revere him like a god, particularly Learman. So the Doctor shows up and they immediately assume that he's Learman's PR guy, which I don't buy in the slightest, as soon as he starts talking about time travel, none of them question as to, hey, how do you know any of this? And then just start telling him all their secrets. Like, this guy could be a spy for all you know. It just feels quite odd how quickly he's accepted by the cast, but I guess it gets the story moving along. Let's talk about the Daleks, who I really do not like in this story. I mean, Nicholas Briggs is at his usual performance level, but some of the voices do not sound like Daleks in the slightest. I understand that you do need to make every single Dalek voice unique so you can tell which one's speaking, but you don't need 6 Dalek voices. At least I'm pretty sure that's how many I counted. 3 or 4 would do just fine. The Daleks' plan is also one that I just don't really get. I can't tell if it's whether I just wasn't listening or it genuinely doesn't make sense, but I'll quickly run through it. So they've created this device called the Temporal Extinction Device, or TED for short, which the Doctor says sounds like a cuddly bear. But when they try and use it in the vortex, it malfunctions, explodes, and creates the time loop. And apparently this thing, if used successfully, is supposed to make them the new Lords of Time. But I really don't know how. This story is marked as Dalek Empire Part 4, which is because in the main range 4 stories were created throughout to tie in with the Dalek Empire series. You've got the Genocide Machine, the Mutant Phase, the Apocalypse Element, and this one. Except I don't really understand how it's meant to tie in. With the Genocide Machine, you have them investigating the Kashrot Library, which leads to them discovering Project Infinity. Then in the Mutant Phase, you have the Emperor transplanting his consciousness into human minds, foreshadowing what he does with Susan Mendez. The Apocalypse Element sets up their power base in the Serifia Galaxy, which then they use to later invade the Milky Way at the beginning of Dalek Empire. So those 3 tie in really well, but for Time of the Daleks, I don't really see it. I mean, the Emperor's here, but he doesn't really do much, and so is the Supreme Dalek, but I can't tell if it's meant to be the same Supreme Dalek, though they do have the same voice. I'm really stumped here, so if anyone knows the answer, please leave it in the comments. Let's talk about what I actually like. It feels like there's been a lot of negativity around this so far. It turns out that this story has actually been foreshadowed quite a lot in previous entries, and there were some that I didn't notice. There's of course the Dalek in Seasons of Fear, which comes about because they send him through a mirror, only for him to be destroyed by some Romans in a ditch. And then there's the fact that Orson Welles didn't even recognise the word Shakespeare, or who he was. A nice little breadcrumb. The paradox is honestly quite well done, and obviously takes inspiration from Day of the Daleks, with the rebels being partly to blame from it. But it also means that throughout the story we can get nice little things that harken back to the paradox if you really listen closely and pay attention. Though it does mean that I probably missed quite a few of them. But in all honesty, that's it. There's not too much else that I enjoyed. It's boring, and if GCSE English didn't already kill my love for Shakespeare, this put the final nail in the coffin. 2 out of 10, exterminate it. Neverland. The penultimate story, and it's the first one to have any real substance in it when it comes to the actual arc. So the Time Lords have finally caught up with the 8th Doctor and Charley, and there's no escape this time. The Doctor plans on sending Charley away to a party planet so he can confront the Time Lords himself. But Charley takes her destiny into her own hands and gets them captured. President Romana has the Doctor unfrozen from time and explains what their plan is. Charley's very existence, her survival from the crash of the R101, has created a tear in time and space, which the CIA predict can take them to a universe of pure anti-time. If matter has its counterpart in antimatter, then by the laws of the universe, time must have its counterpart in anti-time, right? The plan is to enter the anti-time universe by using Charley like a compass, pointing them in the right direction. She'll be inside the TARDIS, which will in turn drag the time station that the Doctor and Romana will be on. Of course, the Doctor doesn't really want to help, but after Romana shows him a Matrix projection of the future where she becomes the Imperatrix and removes the Daleks from history, he's more than eager to come along for the ride. So the plan succeeds, and they enter the anti-time universe with Charley and 2 Celestial Intervention agents being in the TARDIS, and Romana and the Doctor and the Time Station's crew being separated in the Time Station. So the plan succeeds, and they successfully enter the anti-time universe, with Charley, 2 Celestial Intervention agents, and the TARDIS being separated from the Doctor, Romana, and the Time Station's crew. But they've landed on some kind of asteroid, the only landmass in all of anti-time. Or, as Charley terms it, Neverland. Throughout, she puts forward this idea that her and the Doctor's adventures are like Peter Pan. He is Peter Pan, the boy who never wants to grow up, and she is Wendy, the girl who has to grow up, which in this case sadly means sacrificing herself for the good of the universe. The rock that they've landed on is inhabited by the Never People, creatures without fixed form that consume time to sustain themselves. Their leader Centrus takes the face of Charley, as to them she's essentially their saviour. By creating the tear in time of space, she's given them the perfect opportunity to finally escape anti-time and run wild throughout N-space. As villains, the Never People are pretty decent, especially with the twist of who they actually are and what their origins are, but the secondary villain being CIA coordinator Vancell, and I guess tertiary villain being Zagreus, are a lot better to listen to. One thing that this story really does right is its runtime, being split into 2 hour-and-a-quarter segments instead of 4 individual half-hour parts. It really helps to compact the story and make it a much better narrative. Neverland is alright, the change in format is nice, and the setup for Zagreus is good, but at the end of the day, that's all this story is, just setup. And with the runtime of Zagreus being 4 hours, this extends it out to 6.5, which is honestly way too long. 6 out of 10 could be better, but the twists were good and honestly quite unpredictable. And finally, Zagreus. Zagreus sits inside your head. Zagreus lives among the dead. Zagreus sees you in your bed and eats you when you're sleeping. Creepy, huh? And for some reason just randomly showed up in Seasons of Fear. Where do I begin with Zagreus? Nearly 4 hours of content that I really don't want to spoil, but honestly, to make a review of it, you kinda have to spoil this one. For some reason, when I first got into Big Finish stuff, with Time Lord Victorious, I decided to pick this up as well, because it was 4 hours of content for £3 whole. That's like less than £1 for an hour of content. It's great, it's a good bargain. But in hindsight was also a terrible decision. I had absolutely no idea what's going on because I hadn't listened to anything previously, and even after listening to all that stuff, I don't think I do fully understand what happened. This is mainly because it feels like information overload to listen to, and if you don't listen to each of the 3 parts in one go, then you can easily get quite lost. So, where to begin with Zagreus? Well, let's just get through this as fast as possible. Due to the events of Netherland, the Doctor and the TARDIS are now infected with pure anti-time energy, giving them both Zagreus alter egos. The TARDIS can seemingly control theirs, but the Doctor cannot, meaning Charley is trapped within a nightmare with a madman intent on killing her. While the TARDIS takes her through multiple simulations, the Doctor is left to wander around the TARDIS, eventually finding the library where a disembodied Jon Pertwee resides. If you know your history, you'll remember that Jon Pertwee had been dead for about 7 years by this point, so they took lines from an unfinished fan film called Devious and muffled them so you can only just barely understand what they're saying. I'm 100% convinced that half of what he's saying doesn't fit the script in the slightest, but it's just muffled so it slightly sounds like what they want you to hear. Either way, it's great to see him represented here from beyond the grave. Anyway, while he's off reading Lewis Carroll, Charlie's inside of a holographic projection with the Brigadier, who acts as the avatar for the TARDIS. Their first major adventure of 3 is at a military base in the 1950s, with the Brigadier taking on the role of the Minister for Defence, and Charley as his private driver. In these simulations, the TARDIS uses the companions of whichever Doctor is the focus as the main cast of characters. Here it's the 5th Doctor playing Reverend Matthew Townsend. So we've got Captain McDonnell, played by Turlough, Dr. Stone is played by Perry, the Cuban spy Miss Foster by Nyssa, and the Reverend's niece Mary by Carolyn Morris, who apparently plays a 5th Doctor companion called Erimem. To be perfectly honest, I'd never actually heard of her before, which is probably why it's better to have listened to all 49 stories before getting into it. The only 5th Doctor stories I've heard are Spare Parts in the Mutant Phase, which features Sarah Sutton, so yeah. You've probably noticed no Matthew Waterhouse or Janet Fielding, which is down to them not working with Big Finish until the 221st and 87th stories respectively, which is fine of course, but also means there's not going to be any Tom Baker throughout this. So Dr. Stone has been working on the Dionysus Project, which the Reverend has been taking an interest in as a man of God. The project goes horribly wrong and ends up opening a portal to the Divergent universe, which is then closed with a bomb planted by the Cuban spy Miss Foster, which also ends up killing all of the main cast. But why has Charley been shown all of this by the TARDIS? Perhaps the next projection will tell us. Just a note, slightly before this there was another projection based on Charley's life, but it's not too relevant to the plot. It's nice to see though that her headmistress is here played by Sarah Jane Smith, and then we have her mother, Lady Louisa Pollard, played by Polly. It's nice to see them included, but what's crazy is that Annika Wills ends up playing for the rest of the series her mother, Lady Louisa Pollard, so I can't really tell if this is meant to be a projection from the TARDIS using hers, just the avatar, or whether it is actually Polly. Honestly can't say. It also sadly marks the only time that Elizabeth Sladen would show up in the main range before her death in 2011. Next up is the 6th Doctor's, set in early Gallifrey just after the creation of the Eye of Harmony, where he plays a secret great vampire known as Provost Tepesh. He's accompanied by the Great Mother of the Sisterhood of Khan, played here by Evelyn Smythe, a Big Finish companion that I actually know. Her assistant Cassandra is played by Mel, and Tepesh's assistant Ouida is played by Perry. Tepesh and Ouida represent the Council of 3, but there's only 2 of them here as they're implied to have killed the other one. The group enters into Rassilon's foundry, where the man himself shows up, played here by Charley, who obviously has no idea what's going on but still has to act the part. The whole point of this segment is literally just for exposition into the Divergent universe, which is going to be a story arc directly after Zagreus. Basically, Rassilon learned about this force called the Divergence, and deduced using his incredible reasoning powers that one day they would overtake the Time Lords in strength and undo his web of time. So, what did he do? Well, anything that one rational person would do. He sealed them in their own pocket universe until the end of time, only ever getting a taste of freedom when Dionysus was activated in the 1950s. So they're rightfully angry at him. The whole situation ends when Tepesh threatens to kill Rassilon, so he releases the Divergence and the whole facility is sterilized. Like I said, this entire part is basically just exposition, but it's delivered to us by Rassilon's recorder, who is played here by Frobisher. It's a nice touch to add, even though he only appeared in the Holy Terror. Part 3 takes us to Winkle's Wonderland, a fun land currently being fought over by animatronics. There's Goldilocks and her army, voiced by Mel, and then there's the animals. Charley takes the role of General Mouse, we've got Captain Duck, voiced by Ace, Sergeant Gazelle, voiced by Bernie Summerfield, and Corporal Heron, who's voiced by Jason Kane, another Big Finish companion, but this time for the 7th Doctor. I've not heard him, but apparently he's quite good. Speaking of the 7th Doctor, where actually is he? Well, he's what they're fighting over. He's taken the place of Walton Winkle, the original founder and creator of Winkle's Wonderland. And since he created the animatronics, both sides want to capture him to win the war. Except Winkle hasn't exactly got long to live, as just before he was frozen, he was due to die from a heart condition. Frozen, of course, to eventually be woken up one day when the cure was found. It's a bit like a Walt Disney situation where he was frozen, but he wasn't, actually. Probably. Winkle is a bit of a creepy character, but I don't know if that's what he's intended to be as, because he's absolutely obsessed with children, and even cries out at one time, "Won't somebody think of the children?" It turns out that the Wonderland is now on Gallifrey after having moved several times over the years, as the thing is, Winkle's been frozen for nearly 60 billion years, being woken up just before the end of the universe. And since they're right above Rassilon's foundry, the Divergents are released. That's when Charley is pulled out by the Doctor. What ensues is a battle in the Matrix, something about a Jabberwocky, and a line about Alice in Wonderland being a load of old rubbish. The end. So that's about as far as I can get without delving into major spoilers, and honestly I'm not too impressed. I mean, I'd be very surprised if a 4-hour story was a complete masterpiece, but in places it just drags way too much. It also isn't a proper conclusion to the Zagreus story. It acts more as a bridge between the first two series and the next two set in the Divergent universe, which means I left it feeling wholly unsatisfied and incomplete. Though it does contain my favourite touch by far, however, being that the first story opens with the first Doctor titles and ends with the fifth Doctor titles, since that story is mainly about him. Then for the second part, we've got the sixth Doctor titles opening it, and the seventh ending it, just like the part itself. Then part 3 opens with the fourth Doctor's title and ends with the eighth. Not too sure about the placement of the fourth Doctor's, but it still works. Even after all that, I'd still say that this is a 7 out of 10. To have all the main cast back together in one massive spectacular finale is really nice to see, and the little touches here and there are what really make the story, even if it does go on for way too long. And there we have it, we're finally done. All 8th Doctor stories of the first 50 main range, coming out at an average of 6.5 out of 10 for the whole thing, which is honestly pretty good. But that's all from me. If you enjoyed this review, then make sure to leave a like and subscribe down below, as it was actually quite a bit of fun to make, even if it did take like 2.5 hours to record this whole thing, and a lot of line flubs throughout. I mean, I'm recording this thing on an Easter egg box and 2 3DSs. The dedication to this is unreal. But if there's enough demand, I might do the rest of the 8th Doctor stories up to the 100th one. 100. Wait, is that really the title? But yeah, as always, thanks for watching.